Hey everybody, JK from Exilic Music. Welcome to another episode of Understanding Streaming. So we are back with our second episode in this series of conversations that deals with the current era in recorded music, digital streaming. And I think it's important to note at this point that the information that we're sharing here applies mainly to the recording artist. When it comes to a performing artist, they may well still be able to generate some revenue off physical CD sales because they travel, because they tour, because they have an audience that comes to their events. But when it comes to recorded music, the landscape has changed, the game has changed. We are full swing in the middle of the streaming era, and it's important to understand. So last episode, we began a conversation by looking at a brief history of recorded music. And we did so to just get a grasp of how we got from the gramophone and fast forwarded to 2019 where we're in the streaming era. What we want to do in this episode and the next is unpack a couple of key definitions that apply to the streaming era. And I think it's very important because once we understand these key concepts, we can, it's like learning a language so you can have a conversation. Once we understand these concepts, we'll better be able to grasp the big picture. There are four definitions that we're going to deal with in this episode. The first one is streaming itself. What is streaming? The second one is the DSP. Then we want to talk about aggregators and distributors. So let's jump straight in, unpacking some definitions for the music streaming era. So definition number one, streaming. Streaming, and this is kind of textbook definition, is multimedia constantly received and presented to an end user while it is being delivered by the provider. So that's a loaded term. Let's unpack some of the key words there. It's multimedia, meaning it can be audio or it can be video or it can be both audio and video. It's received and presented to an end user while it's delivered by the provider. So the idea here is that the end user can consume the file, the digital file, before it's fully downloaded. So it's different from just downloading a file. So in the old days of digital, you had something like iTunes. And with iTunes, you had to download the file, whether it's a single file or whether it's a zip file of a whole album, for example. You had to download the file first before you could consume it. With streaming, you can consume online. So essentially, it's an online consumption platform. It's not an offline platform. However, nowadays, most streaming providers actually provide an offline feature. So you can make available offline or you can download so that you can consume the file later on. Streaming, like we said, can be audio or video. Examples of video streaming platforms would be YouTube. That's probably the most popular one. Netflix is another video platform for movies and TV, etc. And then, of course, there are the hundreds of music streaming platforms that have come into existence. And that, for our conversation, is where we want to focus. Just one last comment on defining streaming, specifically the concept of streaming. Streaming essentially is consumed via a music subscription. So to access the music, you don't come in and pay for one stream. You pay a monthly subscription. Like in the South African context, you'd pay $60 and you'll get access to 1 billion songs on Spotify or Google Play Music or Apple Music, etc., etc. That's essentially how people pay to consume streaming. For the recording artist, they will need, and we'll unpack this in the other definitions, they'll need an aggregator or distributor to get the music into the store, which is a good segue to talk about our second definition, the DSP. What is a DSP? It's a digital service provider. Some people define it as a digital service platform. Either way, it means the same thing. It's a digital music store. It's a digital version, a virtual version of something like Musica. But in the old days of digital, again, you would go to the store to buy music by downloading it. In the good old days of physical, you go to the record store and physically buy an LP or a single. With the DSPs today focusing so much on streaming, you go to a streaming platform like Apple or Spotify or Deezer or Amazon or Google Play, etc., and purchase a streaming subscription and then get access to the store, which is the DSP. One more thing on DSPs, it's interesting to note that a lot of DSPs now have, well, not a lot, but there are a few DSPs who now have an office or at least an editor in different countries. So when you log on to a DSP, if you're a DSP subscriber, like I'm an Apple user, you go onto the Apple Music front page and then you'll see that the content is contextual. In other words, it's tailor-made for the South African audience. You'll see South African hits, you'll see South African hip-hop top 100, you'll see gospel music, but it's South African gospel music because it's a local version of the Apple Music Store. Now you can get everything or almost everything that's in, for example, some of the global stores, a UK Apple or a US Apple, but the look and shape and the branding of it is tailored for the South African market. And you have South African editors who are responsible for curating South African music and making it available to the South African public. And so with these DSPs, their editors are constantly working with local artists. They're working like talent managers now, working with local publicists or managers to curate the best local music. We'll talk some more about this, the role of the editor in the DSP, when we get to the next episode and talk about the concept of playlisting. But for now, that's a DSP. Let's move on to our last two definitions for this episode. An aggregator. What is an aggregator? Think of an aggregator as a middleman, a middle person who stands between the recording artist and the store, the DSP. So how does a recording artist get their music into a store? Well, traditionally, if you wanted to get your music into a Musica and on the Musica shelves, you couldn't just walk in and give them your CD or your cassette or your LP on vinyl. You needed to liaise with some kind of middleman. Essentially, that middleman was a distributor. An aggregator plays a similar role today. And there are various aggregators who make it possible for you to cross the bridge from here's my music on my computer to there's my music in a DSP, in a digital service platform. And those aggregators exist all over the world. Popular ones are TuneCore or CD Baby, Ditto Music. Ditto Music has a local representative in South Africa now. But all of these aggregators are the bridge, the mediator, the middleman between your music and the DSP. Let's talk about the last definition for this episode, the distributor. I've already hinted at this. The distributor in the old days would get your music into Musica. Today, a distributor does the same. They help to get the music into the DSP. And they do this in different ways. Now, you might say there's a bit of overlap here with a distributor and an aggregator, and there is. Because essentially, the distributor helps the artist to get the music to the DSP. But here's where the distributor plays a unique role, where a DIY artist might go to an aggregator and figure out all the back end of getting into the DSPs and signing contracts or opening accounts and setting up PayPals or whatever the case might be so that they can get their money. The distributor handles all of that for them. So they handle all of the administrative weight of getting music to the DSP. They might work with a variety of aggregators, or they might have direct access to a DSP, in which case they'd be like an aggregator. But essentially, they get your music into the stores for you so that you don't have to do it yourself. Major labels have always had, within their company family, they would have had a publishing arm, a distribution arm. And so they still do today. Universal might have a distribution arm. But there are many independent distributors nowadays. Exilic Music is an independent distributor that helps independent artists get their music into DSP. So you don't have to deal with aggregators and back end and codes and metadata. You come to Exilic Music, we get your music to the DSP. Africori is another example of a distributor that functions on the African continent. And that's essentially what we want to talk about in this episode. Distributors, aggregators, DSPs, and we started off by talking about streaming specific. Please like, subscribe to our channel. Please share this video on your social media platforms. Please engage in the conversation through commenting and asking questions. If you need any assistance with your music distribution needs, your digital distribution needs, please don't hesitate to contact us. Links will be in the description. My name is JK, Exilic Music. This was episode 2 of Understanding Streaming.